Hey, I survived April, and if you were here, presumably you did as well, which means that I, in theory, owe you some wrap-ups from both April and March. And so I thought we could sit down and do a casual wrap-up together today because of that. So we're going to start with March because I kind of stepped back in March a little bit to kind of recalibrate and kind of get the existential dread under control and a lot of things that maybe, I'll come back and talk about in whatever aspect. I also kind of just wanted to recenter myself with both myself and my reading life and kind of remove myself from kind of viewing any online metrics as any reflection or personal reflection on me. And so I think having that space was definitely helpful in that in whatever way so that I can come back and we can have authentic conversations about books and reading and that I can continue to show up in my authentic reading life in whatever capacity that looks like. So with that, let's go ahead and talk about the books. March was a little heavier than April, just with my April being jam-packed, and there were a lot of good things that I read that I'm kind of kicking myself for, in the sense that if I had done a feature Friday on them, to dig into them a little more in-depth in the moment, because I think that they were worthy of those conversations, but I don't know. And the first one that we're going to talk about today is actually one of those books, and that is The Rose Bargain by Sasha Payton Smith, which I was first clued into on Threads, of all places, when I saw someone who was reading an arc and compared it or pitched it as The Fae meets Bridgerton meets The Selection. And so I was immediately intrigued. There may have been some other comps thrown around. The Cruel Prince was the other direct comparison according to the blurb, which makes sense because we center around a Fae prince, Bram, and I had to keep reminding myself that this is a new character and I have not, in theory, heard that name before. It kept itching a part of my brain that felt familiar. But anyway, our protagonist, Ivy, is one of two sisters. There's also like this sprinkling, especially at the beginning and the kind of background of our characters, of kind of the Goblin Market, the poem The Goblin Market, which I don't really, or I'm not really prepared to unpack here. But our protagonist, Ivy, at the beginning of the novel, in the kind of prologue, has had her sister go missing, and she is very close with her sister, and she is convinced that her sister has been taken by the Fae, and so she goes off to kind of search for her sister, and she's kind of like ambling around at the beginning of the book, to my recollection, because the conceit and the kind of background of this world is this is a world where the War of the Roses was stopped by a Fae queen who came in and took over England, essentially, which is interesting in the world building because presumably no other country in this world is ruled by a Fae court, and how that impacts international politics I feel like we really didn't explore. However, in the setup of this, every citizen, however you want to frame that, is allowed or owed, to whatever degree, one Fae bargain, essentially. And for those of the aristocracy, Ivy in particular, our protagonist, and the debuts, the young women who debut, really use this opportunity to trade for something we would probably consider more superficial in effort of obtaining a better match. But with the Fae, there is always a cost. And so what the cost versus the reward, how they outweigh each other. And there's this tenor of violence to it. Like, one trade is, I think it's been a second, but I think one of the girls in the book trades beauty, and she can only make left turns forever because of that. Or people can give up memories or body parts, potentially, like toes or fingers. Or there's one girl who will always feel cold, and so there's a real cost to that. And it kind of illustrates the stakes of the marriage mart that may often feel not as present for us in the modern moment, that I think Bridgerton has done a great job of illustrating, particularly in season 1, making that feel a little bit more immediate. And this is just a different kind of spin on that, and also what young women give up in those scenarios. Now, men also make bargains, but they're much different. So Ivy goes in search of her sister, doesn't find her, but she does find the Fae Prince's half-brother. So he is a prince, but there's kind of bastard prince energy to it, and she is taken home by him. They have like a kind of banter moment, and then Ivy goes home. Her sister returns home soon after, kind of just stumbling home, and she doesn't have a recollection of where she'd been, and this brings a lot of shame on the family and diminishes their position in society in a way that Ivy's debut is meant to kind of rectify, and she kind of is meant, or the weight of kind of saving the family is on her shoulders. But when she goes to debut in front of the queen, they are presented, her and her cohort of debutantes are presented with a different kind of bargain, in that this is the year that Prince Bram, the Fae Prince Bram, is going to be in search of a bride. And so anyone who wants to be considered as his bride puts themselves forward. However, the deal is that they are not allowed to make any other matches that season or ever if they are not chosen. And so I like the world building in terms of the costs that are associated with a lot of these choices in the book. And so Ivy puts herself forward for the sake of saving her family and is put in a living situation, kind of bachelor style, with all the other young women who are vying for the prince's hand for a variety of reasons. And she's both trying to still kind of get to the bottom of what happened to her sister, and also while she is courting essentially the prince, she also is becoming closer to his brother, who views this matchmaking endeavor as an opportunity to work with his brother to overthrow the queen's rule, because the Fae Queen has been the ruler since the War of the Roses, and so there's a lot of politicking going on as well. Meanwhile, the queen is taking the opportunity in secret to kind of play with these young women, test them, put them through trials that they are sworn to secrecy about, and can't tell the prince basically that they're being tortured by his mother at night. And so there's a lot to really love here, especially with like a love triangle setup where you don't really know who you're rooting for. You've got the political machinations going on, just the concept of the Fae I'm always a sucker for, especially in young adult fiction. And I also really, really enjoyed the relationships that were built between these young women. While we followed Ivy most directly, we also got POV chapters from a lot of the other women in the house that kind of reframed some of their actions in relation to our protagonist, but also just complicated all of them and allowed them to be fully realized characters. And I really appreciated that. I think if you liked The Buccaneers, which has a new season coming, and we will surely swing back for that, but I think that that dynamic may be of interest. Vastly different kind of focuses, but very much that kind of robust cohort of young women that we are following. There were ways that this book really faltered for me, though, as well. While I liked the love triangle in theory, I didn't really feel the connection between Ivy and Emmett, the Fae Prince's brother, still a prince. And I'm wondering if most of that may have just been me kind of being older. I wonder if I would have been much more engaged and enthralled by that as a young adult reader, which I think is completely valid because this is for a young adult audience. So I was trying to kind of reframe how I would react to that in the moment as the target audience, because I was very invested in a lot of romances as a young adult reader that I think by my modern reading experience I would probably view as thinner, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's bad, but I did want a little bit more from that. At the same time, I struggled or was frustrated sometimes with Ivy as a character in the sense of the world, because it is established that she is obsessed with the Fae, and she kind of clung to the kind of fairy tale-esque aspects of childhood longer than her sister and some of her friends. And this is also kind of a point of contention. There is a kind of foundering friendship that is part of the female friendship dynamics of this book that I really, really liked. And like Ivy's childhood or like former best friend, that they've had kind of a falling out and are put in this living situation together and are fighting for the same man essentially, and what that means. I really enjoyed that. However, Ivy is supposed to know a lot about the Fae, seemingly until it is convenient for plot reasons that she knows absolutely nothing about the Fae. It feels like she is thrown into these trials with the queen and is completely blindsided by a lot of the bargains and trickery of language that are baked into our knowledge of the fae and fairies. And so I was a little frustrated by that sometimes, because whether she knew something or not really kind of boiled down to plot reasons. And I think that some of the strength of the front half of the book kind of faltered within the plotting of the second half of the book. However, the second half of the book had a lot more of the complications to the female relationships and friendships in the book, which I appreciated. So there was a little bit of good and a little bit of bad throughout all of it, but at the same time, I do think it was still a fun reading experience. I just think potentially those comps set me up to expect this to be like my favorite, except for maybe the selection, in which I like the conceit, but I don't like the execution. So I don't know, really strong conceit. I think the execution is definitely better than the selection, but I do think that there were moments that I wish had pushed a little bit more, and some world building I wish had been fleshed out just a little bit more, but I don't know. We'll see what we get. I don't know how I feel about the end. If you've read this book, I would love to hear your thoughts. That's all I will say so that we don't spoil it. And I recognize maybe I should be moving a little bit quicker so that we can get through all of these books. But next I read Victorian Psycho by Virginia Fato, which is a book that immediately made me want to reread The Turn of the Screw by Henry James. I didn't immediately reread The Turn of the Screw by Henry James, but it's not a long book, so I probably could slip that in. Again, The Turn of the Screw, I say again like this is a point I've raised today, The Turn of the Screw is a classic that I read in high school but did not discuss in class. It was something I read on my own in high school, which makes me sound like a giant nerd, but also I am a giant nerd. But this is a kind of inversion or play on the 19th century governess novel, whether we think of The Turn of the Screw, which I think is the most direct correlation, but I think a lot of people, including myself, will also think of the Brontes, which is also valid. The obvious being, of course, like Jane Eyre, or even Villette, or Viette to a certain degree, but also Anne Bronte with Agnes Grey, which again, I have not read for a second, and I really should go back to reread that, as well as Tenant of Wildfill Hall, which is just an Anne Bronte I love, not an Anne Bronte relevant to this discussion. And I'm kicking myself because I read a library copy of this and I took a picture of the first page and I think I deleted it. So I'm gonna try and pull that back up because I think it sets the tone of this so well. And it's this darkly comedic parody of these 19th century novels, down to the illustrations at the beginning and end of the book that kind of represent the images that we see come out of something like a Dickens, as well as the chapter titles. But it's a very short, punchy little book, because if we're thinking of the kind of gothic governess novel of yore, we think of a younger woman who enters a situation in a house of unknowns, and there's some force, maybe supernatural, potentially beyond her control. And I also haven't read Jane Austen's gothic novel parody in a second, Northanger Abbey, and I feel like maybe I should revisit that after being much more familiar with the gothic genre, but I digress. So the conceit or the concept of that being like this woman in this unfamiliar place, and if she's wandering around at night, what is wandering around in the halls at night outside her door or whatnot. But here, the governess entering the situation is the thing to be afraid of. And so she comes in and there is something off about her. And at the same time, we as readers are in her point of view. And so it makes sense that this book is shorter because it's kind of absurd in that dark absurdism way. And at the end, it's incredibly violent. And because we are in this unreliable narrator is really selling it short point of view, there's only so long really we can sustain that, because it's about the kind of voyeurism of it. But there are also just these really fun images that kind of pop out of this. Fun is a strong word. I'm not thinking of like the violence with the fun, because there is some violence later that, you know, just be aware of that it is very violent. And while it's a kind of campy violence, It's still kind of disconcerting at the end of the day. However, the fact that it's this historical setting kind of gives it a little bit of narrative distance that helps with that as well. At the same time, it's this kind of searing indictment and this exploration of class at the heart of it. And I think this is ingenious too, because it's taking a look at a time where there was this really evident wealth disparity that I think culturally we have this visual shorthand for, and we are then able to draw parallels to today through that without it feeling as immediate while still feeling the catharsis of it. Okay, and so the prologue, again, is kind of playing a little bit on that Dickensian tone and feel. It says death everywhere, death in the river, in the corpses floating upstream and down, in the bellies of the things feasting upon them, death in the drinking water pooling into wells and unspooling within villagers as typhoid and cholera and diphtheria, death on display for an extra sixpence at the wax museum, in the wigs of the living made from the hair of the knot, shorn by enterprising undertakers from corpses sealed in caskets, death melting in a dyed Christmas candle, death in babies, oh so many babies, the unbaptized slipped into other corpses' coffins in a cheating bid for a grave and a funeral, stillborn pillows for the dead, death in the rat pits and pub basements as dogs mangle hundreds to the cheer of their gambling masters. It's crushed in paint, it's papered on the walls, everywhere death. And this just sets the tone so explicitly, and I especially love that ending there. It's crushed in paint, it's papered on the walls, everywhere death. And it's this visceralness to this idea that death was much more mundane a thing at the time, and maybe it's being conceived as much more mundane a thing now than we allow. And there's just a lot that this says in a short little novel. I also, in relation to that, want to read a little bit of the review I wrote for this kind of off the cuff, because I said I often critique books I feel are shocking just to be shocking. And we've talked about this, where choices don't feel rooted in the narrative, but are there for the sake of feeling edgy for whatever reason, or to shock just for the sake of shocking. But that shocking just for the sake of being shocking isn't really what's going on here. And to be fair, I think a lot of times that's not always what's meant in a narrative. It just doesn't necessarily succeed. Here we are pushing to the extreme in order to highlight the thing, which has a narrative name or conceptual word that I can't think of in this moment, but it highlights that disparity. And with kind of rooting ourselves in this extremeness, it also brings attention to the fact that the system has always been violent. But along with that, the language is punchy, there are very distinct visuals and pictures being painted mentally here, as well as twists and turns within the narrative and the relationships between characters themselves, especially as the husband of the house is a little creepy and not the best guy, but then also his wife blames the governess for this and not him, and tries to take that out on the governess. And then the children are little monsters as well in whatever way. And so it's just really an indictment of the whole system. After that, I read Never Gamble Your Heart by Lindsay Lovis, which is the second in the historical romance series that started with last year's Never Blow a Kiss, which we talked about, I believe, in a dedicated feature Friday. And this is following Frankie, who we met briefly in that book as she was kind of ushering her charges as a governess through the park. Very different governesses here, let me be clear. And so we start this book with her meeting the hero and love interest of this book, which I wasn't sure. I was like, oh, we're throwing ourselves in immediately here, because Frankie is a member of this society of spies, governess spies, essentially. And Frankie has been placed in the home of Jasper, who, wait for it, owns a gaming hell, because she is searching for her missing sister, which puts her in connection with the Society of Spies. And there is a lead in relation to a bunch of young women who have been known for speaking out and being very politically motivated, as Frankie is, which is one of the reasons that she is a spinster and a wallflower, which is explored in the book, that they are getting suddenly married off to these men and they have significant dowries. And so there's the idea that there's something going on with the stealing of these dowries, and one of the things these men have in common is Jasper's gaming hell. And so Frankie is placed in this house as the governess of Jasper's ward in order to gain access to his books, essentially. However, he is aware immediately that something is not quite right because, one, he requested a very experienced governess, and Frankie is not that. And then Frankie, in an effort to teach her ward, who is like on the precipice of coming out herself, a little too young, but very eager to enter society, she is trying to teach her a math lesson and accidentally teaches her how to count cards because Frankie doesn't realize she's counting cards until Jasper is made aware because his ward tries to bargain with him for attendance to a certain event via winning a card game. And he's like, wait a minute, who taught you how to do that? And she's not a really good liar yet. And this book was also delightful because it had a ward or a child that I actually really liked. I thought she was a lot of fun. She was meddling, but in a way where she thought she was serving both what she wanted and the adults in her life. And also we had this element of espionage, even if Frankie isn't particularly good at spying, which puts these two up against each other in quarters. We had a hero in Jasper who was absolutely mad about Frankie, and it kind of consumed his thoughts in a lot of ways. If you like Sarah MacLean's Hell's Bells series, I think that this would definitely be a series for you to check out. I absolutely loved this one more than the first. And I was a little worried at first because, again, we thrust ourselves right into that first meeting. And so there wasn't that time for the kind of emotional connection for us as readers with these characters to build up to that first meeting, which is a delicate balance because you also don't want to delay it too long. But I do think it really worked itself out in the end. I really, really enjoyed this. With that first meeting as well, though, the epilogue of this book is setting up the next book in a way that I've found some contemporary historical romances, which I know sounds like an oxymoron, but I hope you know what I mean. Some historical romances that have come out more recently, I've found them doing this. And so just be aware that the next book is set up in the epilogue of this book. Similar again to the Hell's Bell series, where we had Duchess's book teased and a big revelation about Duchess teased at the end of Knockout, and now we are waiting until next year still for Duchess's book. So if you like historical romance, you definitely should check out Never Gamble Your Heart. Next, I listened to The House of My Mother, A Daughter's Quest for Freedom by Sherry Frankie. This was a really harrowing read. I assume if you are online in whatever capacity, you are aware of this situation. This is written by the eldest daughter of a Mormon family vlogging channel, and has been covered pretty extensively online, this book and the revelations therein. Some that have been kind of sensationalized because they are potentially more salacious in terms of kind of like gossip fodder. However, this is a narrative from a young woman who is still really trying to process a lot of trauma, and for a young woman who was exploited online for most of her life for having her story kind of stolen from her in many ways, it was very powerful to hear her reclaim that story via the audiobook, and also to see her protect her siblings and really protect their anonymity, other than like one brother who was already more in the public spotlight. I will admit, I didn't really know about this family other than occasionally seeing criticism prior to everything happening from some commentary channels, because I just am not drawn to that kind of content, and I've always had this kind of weird feeling about it, not in a way where I'm like, oh, I've always been morally superior and I've always known there was something wrong, but also there's always been this kind of air of exploitation to it. And so kind of hearing her try to process a lot of that through this book, and also some of the things that have happened to her outside of family vlogging within the Mormon church, but also I think kind of set up because of her seeking that connection and that place of safety and security outside of her home. There's a lot that this book goes into. It is a very brave narrative, I think that Sherry is still working through a lot of this, and I think that she will come to more revelations and realizations as time goes on, and I really am hopeful and send her all of the loving, supportive energy in that journey and protecting that peace. However, at the same time, I do think that this book coming out when it did was still important for a number of reasons. There are times when books like this come out and I think it's kind of a cash grab, but I think this is notably different because Sherry's story was told for so long outside of her. And as long as she wasn't pressured into this and felt in the mental space to work through her story in this way, I think it's absolutely right that she should monetarily benefit from this, as well as the way we've seen her advocate for both her siblings and other children that are caught up in family vlogging. I think there were absolutely things to say. I think this was cathartic for her. I think it offered her the opportunity to get her side of her story out that many in the wider world have already seen a point of view of. And so I think that it was a really important book for Sherry, for sure. And I also think it was a really harrowing exploration of family vlogging. And honestly, I think it's just the tip of the iceberg. Next, I would like to say on a lighter note, but not really, though we do already have a Feature Friday on this one, I read The Lamb by Lucy Rose, which is a dark kind of like literary horror about a young girl and her mother who live in a cabin on the edge of the woods and catch strays, but in a Soylent Green kind of way, and how their life is upturned one night by the entry of a stray into their life that does not become a stray in the traditional sense, but joins their family. And it is in many ways a coming of age exploration as well from this young girl. It is dark, it is weird, it has a really strong voice, but it does suffer from some pacing issues in that I think it languishes a little bit in some of that voice. I want to say it's just over 300 pages, and honestly, I think it could have been tightened up. At the same time, I'm not the author, but I did feel like certain parts started to feel kind of repetitive. And I don't know if it was to kind of give us potentially a break from some of the darker bits or to help build up that tension. I don't know, but it was definitely interesting, and I do have more thoughts about it in that Feature Friday. And then I reread, and I'm going to go on the record already that I am way behind still on this, and I was behind when I started, but I reread Legendborn by Tracy Deonn for, well, it was the second reread. It was my third read of this book. It stands up. Every time I read this book, I love it, maybe a little more. I really, really enjoy everything this book has to say. That's really throwing off the white balance, so we're going to pull that down. But I have a dedicated Feature Friday, much older, because I've been doing this for about 5 years now. And this book came out in 2020, so forgive, you know, whatever that is, but I do talk about this more in depth in that 5-year-old Feature Friday, and you should definitely check that out. Then as my e-reader phone book in between my Legendborn rereads, I read One Night in Hartswood by Emma Denny, which is a gay medieval historical romance, and I was very excited about it. It follows a young man who is part of the escort for his sister's wedding to this nobleman, and it's all very political. It's supposed to be uniting these two families, very Julie Garwood in the setup, which I love. I love Julie Garwood. Unfortunately, I didn't love this book. It felt thin on the ground all across the board. I hate to say it felt too modern because I feel like sometimes, as we talked about in my historical romance video, that kind of wording is weaponized. However, here it wasn't that, you know, there are gay characters historically, which we know did exist, but just nothing about the world inherently felt like it was actually rooted in a medieval setting. Rather, it felt like we threw some castles in there, and we were in the forest most of the time anyway, so it didn't even really make that much of a difference. We weren't really exploring and diving deep into those political considerations and the interpersonal relations as much. There are obviously different stakes and obstacles to a relationship based on the historical time, and while I think it flirted with it, especially in the kind of resolution of the happily ever after. There was definitely acknowledgement of it. I don't think it really grappled with it within the narrative itself. Additionally, most of the romance itself was kind of mistaken identity, in that one of the couple didn't know who the other one was, didn't love that because it never really felt like that was fully resolved either. And it just felt really thin, which I don't love to say because I did really love the concept of the novel, but it just didn't work for me. Then I reread a book that did really work for me, Bloodmarked by Tracy Deonn, which is the second in the Legendborn series cycle. I have added at least one tab in my reading of this, I think exactly one, and to no one's surprise, it is the Selnick Bree scene at the end. However, it was really nice to read this book with the knowledge of what was to come, because I could kind of relax into it and enjoy those little moments and the setups more with the kind of comfort, to whatever degree, because we know how it ends, of what's coming next. That being said, because I have been lacking that same comfort and the last couple of months have been a lot, I am still only 200 pages into Oathbound, and my plan this weekend is to work on finishing that. I don't know if I'll fully finish it because I want to get some videos prepped too and whatnot, and this is my first free weekend in over a month. But I'm still working on it, so please no spoilers because I'm really loving it. I've just been really distracted, and it's a really big book to hold, and there's been a lot going on. I feel like my voice is going, but we have more books to talk about, so I'll try and speed it up while still giving thoughts in depth. Next, I listened to Y2K, How the 2000s Became Everything by Colette Shade, because I am a sucker for nostalgia. And I went into this kind of thinking about the 90s by Chuck Klosterman, which I also listened to on audiobook years ago when it came out. And on some level, I do think that this wanted to be the 90s by Chuck Klosterman, which is a kind of reevaluation of the decade through the lens of the popular culture. However, this was not the 90s by Chuck Klosterman. It's part cultural analysis and part memoir, but I don't know that the balance works, and I understand wanting to kind of root it in the personal in a way that makes it feel more immediate, but I didn't care, and it felt like it overwhelmed. I think if we'd had like just little blips of it, it really would have worked, but it was just too much. But I don't really know that it knew what it was examining or what it wanted to say. I don't think that any of the observations of this book felt particularly insightful or revelatory. I don't know that it offered me a new perspective on anything, which is what I was really interested in. I was interested in new ways of thinking and perspectives on a time that shaped me, and I think it really did kind of explore the time that shaped me aspect, but I experienced that, so I don't necessarily need to relive that through a book, though I do appreciate a reference to Blow Up Furniture, because I don't think Blow Up Furniture gets enough credit for how much of an impact it had on the 2000s for preteens and young teens. But I don't know, like the 2000s are the decade that shaped me, because I entered the decade as a 10-year-old and I exited the decade as a high school graduate. So there's a lot there for me to unpack, and I don't know that this book helped me unpack it in the way that I hoped it would. Next, a book that was both a surprise and not a surprise, and is what I have on my reading log as my favorite book of March. Yes, we're still in March, but don't worry, I really dropped off in April. Deep End by Ali Hazelwood. Yes, I am but one more person on the internet with thoughts on Deep End, but I'm not gonna go that far into it, surely. If you've been here for a second, you know I've really had a lot of thoughts on Ali Hazelwood over the years. I really enjoy her books. I think that they're really catchy and fun. I really hated the novellas, and I was really struggling with the kind of repetition of the really large man and the very small girl kind of trope and dynamics in her books, which again, I recognize authors that kind of gravitate toward one thing and people that go to that author for that thing and having preferences. I get it. This book really worked for me and also set up possibly one of the funniest callbacks in my friend group, in my romance book club specifically, that I'm pretty sure we will be referencing for years to come, because I was reading it, I just started it, and I was talking about it with one of my friends at a birthday party. We were having delicious, potentially overpriced cocktails, and I asked her what she thought of it because she'd read it. And because it's set collegiately, she goes, oh, it's like that human sexuality class. And then it led to an anecdote where we had a robust discussion about whether this was in fact a universal experience or not. And we determined that it seemed very singular to her college experience. But exploring this idea that these are college-age characters, which led to some really fun cameos that I definitely appreciated. And I did have to kind of remove myself from their ages a little bit within the context of the concept of this book being a little bit kinkier than some of her other work. At the same time, I think that it was very much in measure what the experience would have been for college students. Listen, I was thinking about it as I was reading because I went through a theater program and I've seen some stuff. Not this, but some stuff. I'll believe just about anything. So I wasn't really fazed by it. And so I think that there was a lot of discourse around the time that it came out about the level of spice in it and whether it was the spiciest thing you've ever read or not actually all that spicy. And I think it falls somewhere in the middle, but in a realistic way. What I didn't anticipate was how emotional this book was going to make me, and it feels weird to say that. It feels weird to say The Book Deepened by Ali Hazelwood made me cry multiple times, but it did because it was about the emotional catharsis and the emotional clench. I really responded to Vandy's desire for control, especially within the collegiate setting. I had my own kind of emotional turbulence at certain points of my collegiate career based on, expectations of what I thought the future held, what I thought I should be achieving, what I thought not achieving meant for my future. And at the time, my emotions were a lot more forward and harder to regulate at times in ways that I look back and still get really, really embarrassed about. I didn't do anything like awful, but I'm still embarrassed by some of that emotion that came out at times where I would not have displayed that emotion in that way. But I recognize that instinct in Vandy, this idea that you feel that you've lost control or things aren't going the way you envision them, and wanting that control in all aspects or all other aspects of your life, but also wanting someone to come in and not have to think about things as hard. That kind of like tendency toward overthinking. And I didn't have any of the other stuff of this book, to be clear. Not shaming anyone that does, just setting proper expectations of my own experience. But I think that having that kind of embody that emotional state, I think it really worked. It really worked for me as a reader anyway. Obviously, everyone's going to have their own reading experience, but that really resonated with me. I also really appreciated the complexity of the female friendships. I know I didn't read fully into the discourse that I saw happening around Penelope in particular in this book. I know there was a lot of talk and I didn't read or really pay attention fully to the discourse around Penelope when this book came out, but I understood those kind of messier friendship dynamics and emotional dynamics, especially at this age range. Like, as much as I say I wanted to forget that they were college kids, at the same time, I didn't fully forget that they were college kids, and I thought that she had a really emotionally interesting arc as well. I, of course, liked Lucas. Would I have loved to see them together just a little bit more? Sure. But I don't know. I think it was a really well done book. I think the pacing could have been tightened maybe a little bit at certain points, but overall, really, really loved this book. Next, I read The Night and the Butcherbird by Alix E. Harrow, which is a kind of fantastical dystopian short story. Yeah, short story. I don't think it qualifies as a novella that I read on Kindle Unlimited. I really enjoy Alix E. Harrow's voice. I thought that this was really well done. As someone who doesn't particularly like dystopias, especially climate disaster dystopias, this was definitely that, but it was also a little queer and will allow it. So if you're looking for something to slip in between longer reads and have Kindle Unlimited, I would definitely recommend that you check that one out. Next, I used my Valentine's Day free Libro.fm credit. I forget what I did to earn that credit. I think it was just listening to a certain amount of audiobooks. Either way, I was gifted an audiobook credit to Libro.fm for completing some challenge, and I usually try to share those on my Instagram when I see them because I love a free book, especially from Libro.fm. And with said credit, I purchased Frenemies with Benefits by Cynthia Williams, which is the third in the Peachtree Cove series. I have not read the others in the Peachtree Cove series, but I did recognize that there were some cameos from some other couples in the Peachtree Cove series because I am a romance veteran. But this is a small town romance about the owner of a bed and breakfast who is just finishing up a pretty nasty divorce with a real piece of work who cheated on her with her front desk girl, and the owner of a local nursery who provides plants for the bed and breakfast, particularly for events, which is how we see them interact the most at the beginning of the book. But they also went to high school together, so there's some history there. It's a small town, and the kind of small town romance that feels true to me in that everybody knows everybody's business. Like, there are scenes of them going out to whatever bar and people show up and maybe some drinks get spilled and maybe some drinks deserve to get spilled, and just the small town gossip of it all. And that really felt present in a way that everyone around this couple kind of exhausted me, but in a way that felt true. And I really appreciated how the couple was reacting to things. At the same time, because of that, their interactions weren't as deep as they could have been. And I don't mean that it was lackluster, but just that they had to be adults with their own businesses to run and families to manage. And so they couldn't just like slip off away together forever. But I think that within the small town dynamic, I think it really worked, and it was a really fun listen. And that was the end of March, and April should be a little quicker. I started the month with The Unworthy by Agustina Bastarrica, which we have already talked about in a Feature Friday. I started on a high because this was my favorite of the month, which isn't really a surprise because it's a weird, dark horror by an Argentine author, and that's kind of my sweet spot. I never would have expected horror to be kind of a sweet spot, but Argentine horror, different story. Also, in defying expectations of what you think you like, this is technically a dystopia. It is set in a weird facsimile of a convent post-climate disaster, and there is a lot going on in this very thin book. It's so well done. The language is so interesting as always. Really loved it. Next, I listened to Everything is Tuberculosis, The History and Persistence of Our Deadliest Infection by John Green. I felt duty-bound to consume this book, whether with my eyes or my ears in some way, as someone who has read a lot of historical fiction where consumption plays a role. And obviously consumption is tuberculosis. And I think that he does a really good job at bringing awareness kind of across his media presence to this disease that really shouldn't be a problem anymore, but is still very much a problem and very present and persistent. I think that the awareness is very important. I like that he humanized and really illustrated the realities of the disease in the modern moment. I also like that he drew those threads or tied those threads to the past and the ways that tuberculosis can be tied to different things. Like, I really enjoyed the part where he was like, can tuberculosis be blamed for starting World War I? Maybe. Those kinds of things. I like those mental exercises, and I would have liked more of the history of tuberculosis and the ways that it intersected with history in the past, which we definitely get. I especially, again, like his section talking about the kind of aesthetics of it, especially during like the Romantic period and how tuberculosis impacted art and culture. I think that that was all phenomenal. And my only note really is I would have liked it to go even further and even deeper. However, I also appreciate that it was tightened surely to appeal and reach a broader audience, and so I absolutely respect those decisions as well, because the awareness is the point. Next, I have another historical romance. I read The Wayward Duke by Katrina Kendrick, the fourth in the Private Arrangement series, which again, I've not read any of the rest of the series, and that's on me, but I did get the sense that this is something we were building toward, because this is following an estranged Duke and Duchess, and at the beginning of the book, Caroline, our Duchess, is painting a man because she is an artiste when Julian the Duke comes home, and he does not live there, so it is weird. And he is kind of stopping there en route to somewhere else I'm pretty sure being the continent, in the sense that he's gonna continue to get out of her life. But she wants to use this opportunity to kind of reestablish some society things, and they come to some arrangements, and at the same time he gets pulled into an investigation involving some code breaking, so there is some espionage that definitely made me interested in this book. The espionage is definitely there. It's lighter than I thought it was going to be, I'm not going to lie. I really enjoyed the tension, especially at the beginning of this novel, because we have this history, this weighted history between these two, and we don't, or at least I didn't, because I haven't read the others, really know what's going on. And here it introduced the use of flashback as well in a way in the first half I found really compelling, because these two were friends when they were younger. And in one of the early flashbacks, we are clued into the fact that Julian the Duke, who was married to Caroline the Duchess, was interested in her friend. And so, like, figuring out how these two got married, what happened, what the big blow up was that has been keeping them apart, at the same time that there is all of this real angst and sexual tension. There is a heat to this. Even back to that first flashback, she ends up drawing Julian nude. And so there's a clear history there, and there are clearly still feelings to the fact that Julian can recognize her work out and about in the world, even though she's using a fake name. I think that the setup in the first half of this book was excellent. I think that the tension, again, was really fantastic. I think that it faltered a little bit, especially in the second half, because everything felt resolved really easily in wake of that really delicious tension. And I liked the reconciliation and the camaraderie between these two. And I think it could have worked if the espionage element was a little bit more active, because then it would have given them, and I think the impetus was to give them this common goal that they were working toward together. But I think that the emotional beats were reconciled just a little too easily. I think that there was a way to just live in that a little bit more. And I'm not saying sustain the angst unnecessarily, but it felt like there was just a little bit too much of an emotional jump that we didn't get to see that full beat play out, if that makes sense. Okay, next I listened to Original Sins, The Miseducation of Black and Native Children and the Construction of American Racism by Eve L. Ewing. This is a really important nonfiction exploration of the ways that racism is baked into our education system in ways that are both obvious, probably, in the modern context, and less obvious in the modern context. I think it's a really important perspective and something to think about when we think about the ways our education systems work. I think that it's very deliberate. I think that the focus on education in the modern moment is very deliberate. And I think that Ewing really traces and explores a lot of these nuances in a really accessible way, able to make those connections in a way that illustrates the problem. I actually think that I need to revisit this text physically, having listened to it, so that I can maybe sit with certain sections a little longer, notate as needed, and dive deeper into it. I'm not an educator, so I don't need to do that for the sake of implementing or thinking about how I'm implementing things in the classroom, but I do still think it is really valid. I think that it would be an excellent point of view to take into consideration, a necessary point of view to take into consideration if you are an educator, because these systems have been built up and sometimes it's easy to lose sight of how the systems are operating on the day-to-day, especially because teachers across the nation are overworked and underpaid for the work they're already doing. And so it's easy to lose sight of some of those things. But I think Ewing comes at this from a background in education. She's able to pull out examples from her own life in the classroom to illustrate some of these topics, but also it doesn't feel too in the weeds at the same time. I think that it's a really important book, and that is why I want to give it more due consideration in how I'm approaching what it's saying. Next, I read Emily Wilde's Compendium of Lost Tales by Heather Fawcett, which is the third and final entry into the Emily Wilde series, which I was kind of speculating, like, how would we continue this series because of the concepts of the titles of the book. And this puts us firmly into fairy with the reclaiming of Bamblebee's court, which has been kind of the central focus since the first book, kind of what we've been building toward, especially with Emily being a preeminent scholar on the Fae. And so getting her to live in the realm of the Fae and explore and how she will interact with the Fae has been a really fun thing to kind of conceive of. Now, I do think that this suffered somewhat from being fully in the realm of the Fae because it lost some of that charm of the kind of academics of it, even if we really were still trying to root it through the idea of tales. And I did really like the ideas of story it was playing with and how stories can reveal things, especially because fairy tales do reveal things. They were originally conceived of, because I took a fairy tale class in college, to be a warning and to teach children what to not do or to be afraid of in order to protect them in whatever way. And so a lot of the mythology and the bleeding of mythology and fairy tale, which are sometimes and often different, there's a lot to go into there. But here we have to build out the world of fairy that we briefly encountered in the last book, and are also exploring the idea of ruling over a court, which is dynamic, especially as Bamblebee is not a particularly good ruler. But it felt overall to me as a reader very flat. Unfortunately, I didn't feel, as much as I enjoy the kind of coziness of things and getting to explore these worlds with Emily and Bamblebee as they are, it didn't feel like their characters really got to develop all that much. And Bamblebee himself, I really would have loved to see change in any type of way. And he had a change of environment, but I didn't really get a full sense of him, and I feel like he was kind of sidelined for some of the book as well, and I really wanted to see more of their relationship within a different context, especially as he'd spent much of the last book indisposed, which I begin to wonder if that was more of a kind of narrative crutch, so we didn't have to work with him quite as much, because then we have to develop him, but he's a somewhat kind of Wilde-esque character. I think in my first review of this series, I talked about him feeling very Oscar Wilde in his presentation, kind of the importance of being earnest-esque. And the stakes of this book are conceivably high because we have Bamblebee's stepmother who is maybe trying to reclaim the throne in some way, or has cursed the kingdom in whatever way, and we're trying to break the curse, and the kingdom is at risk. And so there are high stakes, but it doesn't really feel like it. I didn't feel invested in what was going on in any particular way, and that was a real bummer for me because I do think that these books are fun, but at the same time it's still a charming series, and I think that it's attempting to navigate that balance between high stakes and stakes to keep the action moving and being a cozier read, which it absolutely is. So I think that maybe it's just how I respond to that balance and not necessarily a flaw of the book, because there are still unequivocally stakes, and I do still enjoy the characters and the world and getting to play in it. I just felt somewhat, it did that thing, and there are a couple books recently, so maybe it's just my state of mind, where it feels like it's keeping me a little bit at a narrative distance, and I'm not able to kind of fully conceptualize of everything in my brain. Then, because I decided I needed something familiar, I reread via audio, but I'm going to show my paperback, All the Feels by Olivia Dade, especially because it teed me up when I realized that the third book was also available on audio immediately. And while I pre-ordered the third book on Kobo, I hadn't yet read it. So I did read it, audio and physical, but I read that in May. So we'll talk about that in May. But I reread All the Feels, which I can confidently now say, spoiler alert, which is the first book, is my favorite of the series. I love this book. I think it has officially become a comfort read to me, and this book series follows a kind of parody of a Game of Thrones-esque show, which is an adaptation of the Aeneid, and has a bunch of mythology. And so here we are following the actor who plays Cupid in this show, who is being given a minder in Lauren, and we meet both of them in the first book. But he's being given a minder, Lauren, who is supposed to be keeping him out of trouble because at the start of the book, he has gotten into some trouble at a bar, which we find out more about over the course of the book, but the presumption is that he was drunk and disorderly, which is contested later. But Lauren is the cousin of one of the showrunners who was on essentially a mental health break from being a mental health advocate in a hospital and an emergency room, and having some burnout associated with that. And one thing in this read that I'm sure I recognized or clocked in the first read, but I hadn't remembered as viscerally, was appreciating that these are characters in their mid to late 30s. As I enter my mid to late 30s, or staring down my late 30s, I'm 34. We're not there yet, but I did appreciate having that diversity as well as the body diversity in this book, and just the golden retriever energy of Alix, which is undeniable, and his fan fiction escapades as well, and just the way that they balance each other out. It's definitely a kind, not grumpy, because Lauren isn't necessarily grumpy. She's just not as high energy as Alix. So it has some of those dynamics of the grumpy sunshine for sure. It also scratches the itch of the celebrity romance because it's a celebrity romance, and has Alix looking out for Lauren as he begins to develop feelings for her, whether he can articulate them at first or not, and the way that they kind of rib each other, specifically Alix ribbing Lauren, the way that he can kind of recalibrate when something he jokes about, he realizes that she takes it a different way, or that it may read a different way to her based on her lived experience than he intended it, and is able to hear her out and reevaluate and recalibrate. There's just a lot to love about this book, and I do love a lot about this book. This is definitely one of my current favorite contemporary romances, so it was a nice revisit for me amidst all of the craziness of last month. And then finally, I read The Duke's Guide to Fake Courtship by Jade Lee, which is a Harlequin historical. I know this observation has been made before, but browsing through the Harlequin titles is really a reminder that Harlequin titles were AO3 tags before AO3 tags existed. That ability to really indicate exactly what we're going to be getting with a book from the title. That being said, the fake courtship in this was somewhat late comparatively for that title. Now, as someone who's been reading historical romance for over 2 decades now? No, 2 decades, around 2 decades, maybe just shy of. I don't think I was really deep in historical romance at 14. Still, I have a track record, as we've established, but I've never really been deep in the Harlequins, which is kind of my blind spot, because I don't know if it's, they did have a reputation when I was growing up, but I don't know if it was so much that, as when I did start picking them up, they are a noticeably different pacing than something like an Avon, which is really where I kind of sunk in as a reader. And I was just more comfortable with the Avon pacing. I think I really found my space within Avon in particular, but also the other publishers that have the similar pacing for their historical romances in particular, but also Harlequin contemporaries as well, just how the pace has to work. And so I didn't find myself gravitating to them. I'm not as knowledgeable on their release schedule as some of the other historical romance readers you may follow across platforms, to my chagrin. So I'm trying to get better at that and slip some in. And so this is one that came out this year. Additionally, I also appreciate that they do have diversity in their list. And this is one that came out this year, and I wanted to give it a read. And this is following Grace and Declan. And I don't know that I've had a romance hero that I can recall named Declan, but I do have a former coworker whose husband's name is Declan. That has no bearing on anything, and I never met the man. However, at the start of this book, we are introduced to Declan following a birthday where he had presumably been out enjoying himself the night before when his mother storms in. And we get the feeling that his mother does this a lot, and that also she's awful, because she is. And so she storms in upset because Declan's cousin, and Declan is the Duke, has inherited the dukedom somewhat recently, and there's a lot of baggage related to that in relation to his father, and particularly his father's temper, and Declan being acutely aware of not wanting to inherit that temper and that reputation. And so his mother storms in and says that his cousin is courting someone unsuitable. This turns out to be simply because she is word that he is courting someone who is Chinese, because he is courting someone who is Chinese, and she is coming in with her father, who had spent time in China, and her sister are coming over, and Grace has also spent time on a boat. So we also get some boat book energy from this, because Declan first meets her on a ship that his cousin has eyes on. Basically, he's courting Grace for this ship, and Declan gets the sense that his cousin doesn't have honorable intentions. And so at first he's trying to protect Grace, sure, but he's mostly trying to thwart his cousin, who's being a real piece of work and feels entitled to things. Though there is some bad blood there, like there's some childhood resentment that is clearly festered between these two. And so initially, Declan is just like, you're not courting her for the right reasons, and also I'm not just going to give you something. And so he's got his eyes on his cousin, and therefore he has his eyes on Grace because he wants to see what his cousin is up to. And so Grace ends up going to a tea with the mother and aunt, who is the cousin's mother. I forget his name. I'm not going to lie to you. And some other young ladies show up, and they are slighting her throughout this tea. And Declan shows up, recognizes the slight, and really kind of lays into his family about it. And he ends up kind of really feeling drawn to Grace and returning to Grace, and something happens in him trying to protect Grace from his cousin, to his mind, that throws them further together into this fake dating scenario, and things happen. And so there's a lot that is about kind of going up against the ideas of society and what society expects, because Declan does not think that Grace is the wife for him for most of the book. And there's layers to that because he, in his mind, it's not just because she's Chinese, but in some ways it is in the sense of how she can hold her own against these people in society that are always going to be kind of coming at her with racism, which we see Declan's own family do. And so over the course of the book, they get closer, they kind of both, and Declan especially, kind of realizes what Grace is capable of and what he's willing to sacrifice for his family and this idea of reputation. And also what I found most compelling about the book, because Grace spent a significant amount of time pretending to be a boy on a ship growing up so that she had some freedom there and her backstory, but exploring her anger and righteousness in relation to Declan's and how they can kind of meet each other. I thought that was really compelling. At the same time, I do think it stalled. As much as I say, like, usually a Harlequin energy and pacing is way too quick for me. And it was too quick for me at times in some of the emotional revelation. I think what I'm trying to articulate there is that sometimes we have to take it for granted where that emotional turn comes from. We don't have as much time to kind of play it out. And so I think sometimes we skip some of those beats. And I do think that we have that sometimes here, though I was pleasantly surprised in getting a lot more of that than I thought we might. And at the same time, at times, I thought it stalled just a little bit. I am also interested in how this will continue, because I did get the sense that we were setting up another book, and I got a sense that we were setting up the next book with Declan's cousin and Grace's sister, who are kind of circling each other sometimes throughout this book, but Grace's sister finds out kind of what he was up to over the course of the book and is not pleased with that. And so I'm very interested in seeing how we redeem him, especially within Harlequin pacing. So definitely still very much interested in continuing with the series as it continues. But with that, that is what I read in March and April. And if you were still here, thank you for hanging in with me for all of it. And also thank you for kind of bearing with me as we had a slower start to the year over on the channel, or here on the channel, or, you know, what have you. It wasn't necessarily for a lack of ideas, but for, you know, the kind of existential dread of the world around us, and also feeling like I needed to kind of recalibrate in my own reading life. Whether I succeeded in that, I don't know, but I definitely focused on it, which was very nice, and just kind of figured out what I want for potentially the next 5 years of this channel, as I have been posting here for 5 years now regularly, which is kind of mind-boggling. So thank you for being here, whether you are new today or have been here for the entire 5 years or however long in between. I really, really appreciate you caring what I have to say about books in any way and giving me the space to talk about those with someone. So thank you. Like and subscribe if you feel like it. Read something good and let me know what you've been reading over the course of the last 2 months. And yeah, bye.